Hi, and welcome to Chapter 3.1 of Art Appreciation Arts 1301. It's me, your instructor, George Neal. Okay, so we're about to kind of shift gears a little bit in this course. We spent the first approximately half of this course talking about sort of the basics of art, talking about learning basic terminology and vocabulary, learning the elements and principles of design, and then learning about the basic materials and methods to make art with. Now we're going to look at the history of art, and we've already, kind of covered a little bit of history. I mean, it's impossible to talk about famous works of art without touching on the history of it, but we're going to do this in a more sort of concentrated, concerted way. We're going to start at the very beginning of art history, around 40,000 BC or so, and then we're going to move all the way up to the modern day by the end of the semester. But today's lecture is primarily going to focus on ancient art. We're going to look at the art of what we call the Paleolithic period. Then we're going to look at the art of the ancient Mediterranean area and Egypt. And then next chapter we're going to look at Greece and Rome. So we're going to be covering the ancient world basically this week. So let's just jump on in. We're going to start sort of here in Europe, and by the end of today's lecture, we're going to be here in Mesopotamia, looking at various cultures of the ancient world. Prehistoric art in Europe and the Mediterranean. The first artworks made by humans comes as early around as 40,000 years ago. So around 40,000 BC or so, human beings started to make the first, what we could call art. Humans had been making art for about 40,000 years, or making designs about 40,000 years before this in implements like axes and weapons and things like that, sort of geometric patterns. But they had been making representational art, pictures of things, until around 40,000 BC or so. And these will come in the form of paintings on cave walls and sculptures. The main subject matter are going to be things that were vital to survival, so food and procreation. And these give us an important record of our lives of our ancient ancestors. So we're going to be looking at a period called the Paleolithic. So Paleolithic, what was Paleolithic? What is the Paleolithic period? Well, it literally comes from the Greek terms meaning old stone, Paleolithic. So it literally means the old Stone Age. And this is a term used by archaeologists to describe the different kinds of stone tools that were used in this period. So Paleolithic. And this is a long, long period in history that ends around 12 to 10,000 BC. The Paleolithic also covers the time period of an ice age. So throughout most of the world, and especially in the parts of Europe that we're going to be looking at, the world was more or less in a state of permanent or semi-permanent winter. It was extremely cold. Our ancient ancestors were hunters and gatherers. They tended to be nomadic. There are no real permanent settlements. They might occasionally stop and stay in some places, maybe seasonally, living in caves. But for the most part, human beings used temporary shelters made out of animal skins and bones and things like that, that could be portable because they had not developed agriculture, and they needed to follow herds of animals around or to cultivate raw fruit and vegetables from wherever they grew. So they couldn't be stationary. So there are no sort of permanent villages or things like that. However, a lot of the images we see do come out of caves. So even though these caves would not have been settlements per se where people lived year-round, they were certainly seasonal places that people would come back and visit. And as we're going to find out, these caves often had probably spiritual purposes, as we'll see. So the earliest images come from a cave in Spain called El Castillo. in Cantabria, Spain, and they consist mostly of, well, images of animals and handprints that you can see here. These are actually made by taking powder, different pigments. So in this case, various kinds of umbers or dried clays or mineral pigments, and grinding them up, and then putting them in a reed, putting one's hand against the wall, and then taking the reed and blowing this powdered substance onto the wall. It sticks to the cave wall because there is either animal fat or even spit and saliva placed on the wall to hold this stuff in. Now, how do we know how old this stuff is? We know how old it is because of a carbonate mineral called calcite that has formed on top of this painting. So we use a method now called carbon-14 dating that basically measures the half-life of this isotope of carbon-14, and it's really regular. Basically, it basically dissolves at a very consistent rate, or decays at a very distant rate, and we can get a pretty good idea of how something old is by the decay of this isotope. So we know that anything that is below this layer of calcite on top of the image has to be at least as old as the calcite, right? We can't date the drawing itself, but we can date the deposits on top of it. So there's a possibility that these images could actually be older than 40,000 years, but we know they have to be at least 40,000 years old. Okay, so this is very typical in the sense that this of lots of cave art, in that it's made from natural materials, minerals, clays, things like that, and then also human or animal products like fat and spit to act as a kind of a binder. I find the Paleolithic period fascinating because it was a period of time that was very difficult for early human beings. We were especially in Europe, the regions that we're looking, because we were hunter-gatherers. We were nomadic. We had to travel around. Infant mortality rates were very, very high. Babies often and usually did not survive. Most people didn't survive past their 20s. I mean, typically you were an old man or an old woman if you made it to the ripe old age of 25. It was a very difficult life. And yet, despite these hardships, human beings found the need to make images. Why? We're not exactly sure. And how long had human beings been making images? Once again, we don't quite know because a lot of the probably earliest images were made using non-permanent materials, impermanent materials. So things like taking a stick and drawing in the ground, things like that, maybe using chalk or other kinds of minerals to draw on rocks on the outside, and it would wash away with rain or wind or erode or whatever. So we don't really know how long the tradition of making images occurred before these images that we have discovered. But these images that we have found in caves are really well preserved because they're protected from the elements, they're protected from sunlight, so they have survived. But they may not represent the earliest images made by human beings. They just represent the earliest images that we still have. And you're looking at a detail of a cave art from a cave called Altamira in Spain. Altamira is a fascinating cave, primarily because it was the first ever discovered by modern humans. And it was discovered completely by accident. Marcelino Sanz and his daughter, a little girl named Maria, were on their property in Spain, walking around, and the little girl sees a little hole leading into the ground. This brave little child, who's, I don't know, 7 or 8 years old or so, squeezes in where her father couldn't, and she finds herself in this chamber, a rather large chamber. She's kind of dwarfed by the ceiling, and she hears echoes, and it's pitch black. And all she has in her little hand is this pale little lantern. She holds it up. She looks up at the ceiling and she sees something. She sees these mysterious forms. And as she stands on her little tippy toes and gets closer, she realizes that they're pictures. Really, really, really old pictures. And as her father eventually comes in with her and they bring in more light, they realize they're looking at images of bison. They're looking at these large animals. And these are large pictures. These aren't tiny images, but these are 5 foot or so pictures. So they're, about half life size or so. Half scale images of these actual animals. And they are blown away by them. And they go to their local university and their local historical societies. And this is, in the 1870s, 1880s in Spain. And they say, I think we found something really, really old. And they're basically laughed off. A lot of people are convinced that they're trying to pull a prank or a hoax. That these images don't really, they're not ancient. They're actually modern, and they're not made by our early ancestors. They look too good. They're too well preserved. There's no way these could be ancient works of art from our prehistoric ancestors. And a few decades later, when the technique of carbon-14 dating is invented, these paintings are analyzed, and Maria and her father were proven right, that these are actually ancient works of art. Now, Altamira, the paintings were made towards the end of the Paleolithic period, around 13,000 to 11,000 BC, or BCE, as you'll see. Let's talk about that really quickly. So, you'll sometimes see in books the term BCE instead of BC. BC, of course, means before Christ. But in the academic world, where we often have an international community of scholars, many who are non-Christian, we use this more generic secular term, BCE, which means before Common Era. And it means the same thing as BC, and I don't care which term you use. It doesn't matter to me, but I just want you to get used to seeing this term, because this is the delineation you'll see used in most textbooks. And then you'll also see, instead of AD, you'll see the term CE. So AD, it does not mean after death, but AD actually means Anno Domini, which is the Roman term, the Latin term meaning year of our Lord. Anno meaning year. Domini, meaning of our Lord. So the year of our Lord. So instead of AD, you'll often see the term CE, which means Common Era. So before Common Era and Common Era, BC, AD, I don't care what you use, just know them both. So, okay. All right, guys. So, these are very much towards the end of the Paleolithic era, but they're still very, very old. These things are, 13,000 years old, approximately. And these are very typical of the kinds of images we'll see in Paleolithic cave art. They're large scale. They are of animals. This is the primary subject of Paleolithic art, are animals. We rarely see humans in paintings. We'll see sculptures of humans, but we hardly ever see paintings of humans. And when we do, they're very abstract. But images of animals tend to be very realistic, very lifelike, and very large. Okay, so why animals? Well, one of the theories is that these are food source animals, and that certainly makes sense. In some of these images, like in this image from the caves at Lascaux in France, we see a horse being hunted with arrows or spears being thrown or shot at it. So these could be food source animals, and some of them were, but some of them were not. In fact, most of the animals that are pictured, with some significant exceptions, are mostly animals that were not eaten. These were animals that were too large or too swift or just difficult to hunt. when you take into account the kinds of technology and weapons that our ancestors had at that time. So, pardon me. It's been a long day, guys. So typically, with some major exceptions, these are typically all powerful animals. You never see small animals. You'll never see like a bunny rabbit or a squirrel in these ancient Paleolithic paintings, but instead you will see large animals, powerful animals, horses, oxen, bison, different kinds of wildcats, things like that. This is from Lascaux, which is one of the largest and most extensive of the Paleolithic caves. There's somewhere around 6,000 images throughout this very complicated cave system. And I want you to keep something in mind as we look at these. These cave images were not easily seen. They were hidden, oftentimes deep within a cave system, sometimes, a tenth of a mile or even further deep. They were often in very difficult to reach places. You had to sometimes squeeze through very small areas. They weren't necessarily accessible to everyone, and it would have been incredibly dark in here. You would need a torchlight to see, because it's basically pitch black because you were very, very far away from sunlight. So the question is, why? Why create images that are difficult to see in places that are hard to get to? Why animals? Why put them on the ceiling? Because most of these are on the ceiling. Why powerful animals? Why on a large scale? And our best guess is that these probably had religious connotations. These animals were either represented sort of like spiritual forces, or maybe were perhaps worshipped as gods or deities themselves. We don't exactly know, because we're dealing with prehistory, meaning that we have no written information. But we do know that these were important. And also think about the effect of walking into a cave, right? You walk into this cave with your torchlight. As you walk deeper and deeper, crawling sometimes, in very dangerous, precarious areas, you get to this large chamber deep within a cave. All of a sudden, it's almost more like a temple or a church, isn't it? It's like this sacred, beautiful, hidden space. And as you enter with your torchlight, imagine the way that dances around on the ceiling. And imagine these magnificent, powerful beasts, these forces of nature, flickering and moving above you. It would have been incredible, wouldn't it? And then imagine even the sounds of the cave. There probably would have been some sort of chanting going along. And you're inside a big, empty, echoey chamber. These are special effects, right? These are meant to evoke a kind of spiritual mindset, a spiritual, sacred space is what we're looking at. And these animals represent some sort of divine power. Now, were these worshipped as gods? Were these feared as demons? We don't know. We have no idea of the kinds of rituals that were performed, except they probably involved some sort of sacrifices, because there are fire pits that have been found near these images. So, things might have been burnt, what we call burnt offerings. Things burned in a fire might have been made to appease these gods or whatever they are. But ultimately, we can only guess. One thing you will notice about most of these images, it doesn't matter what cave system we're looking at, but the animals are often shown overlapping each other, sometimes even drawn on top of each other. These images aren't meant to show us like a group of animals. So don't think of it this way. You're not looking at one scene involving a bunch of animals hanging out together, but instead you are seeing images that were laid on top of each other over a period of years, sometimes tens of thousands of years. That's what's mind-blowing about some of these images, is that they were created over a span of tens of thousands. I mean, like the oldest caves we have are around 40,000 years old. The youngest caves we have are around 11, 12, 13,000 years old. So there's a 30,000 year difference between the oldest cave art and the last cave art. 30,000 years is an incredible amount of time. I mean, that's longer than, modern civilization. That's like 5 times longer than civilization has existed. So we're looking at incredible expanses of time. All right, what else? What other kinds of stuff did our early ancestors make? Well, they made statues. They made sculptures. This is an image called, on the left, the Woman of Willendorf, and the image on the right is the Venus, or sometimes called the Woman of La Selle. So what are these? These are, the image on the left is the one that's really important. And I'm gonna change this up just a little bit so we can move this out of the way, and we can move this over a little bit so I'm not in the way. All right. Okay, back to your regular schedule programming. All right, so what's so important about this image over here on the left? Well, the Woman of Willendorf is the oldest sculpture, or was the oldest sculpture ever found when it was discovered in the early 1900s, so a little over 100 years ago, in Central Europe, in Austria, along the Danube River, near a town called Willendorf. This little statue was found. And this thing is not even 5 inches tall, so she's very small. She's like an action figure. But what is she? What does she do? Well, she is probably a fertility figure. If you look at her features, you can see that parts of her body have been emphasized. Specifically her breasts, her belly, and her genitals. And these all have to do with reproduction. But not only have those parts been emphasized, but parts that don't involve reproduction, her face, her tiny skinny little arms, her feet, which are almost non-existent, they've either been completely reduced or just erased altogether. So parts of that are important have been emphasized. How this figure was used, once again, we don't know. We're dealing with prehistory. She could be what we call a fetish, and fetish doesn't have the same terms as it does today. A fetish, in the anthropological sense of the word, a fetish simply means an object that is meant to have some sort of special power, right? Think of it as like a good luck charm in a way. Like modern day, you might have a lucky coin or a rabbit's foot or a horseshoe or something. That's in the scientific academic sort of way, the very definition of a fetish. Although I would not call it that to your friends because they'll look at you funny. Don't say I have a fetish for horseshoes. No, don't do that. But what we mean in the anthropological sense is this object that has special power. And this might have been carried around to ensure pregnancy. At a time where having babies was very difficult, infants were more likely not to survive than to survive. These things could have been really important. They could ensure pregnancy or assure a successful pregnancy or ensure that the child would be healthy. We don't know. And we don't know if they were used, like, if like, say, a woman carried these around and during, bedtime with her significant other, if she put this under the pillow or something to ensure that pregnancy would occur, or maybe she carried it around. We're not sure. Or maybe it was used in a ritual and made as an offering to a goddess or something. We don't know these. We don't know anything about what these people worshipped or what they believed. We just have very scant evidence, very tantalizing evidence. But we can make a pretty, I think, good guess here that this object is a fertility object. Over here in this image, this is a low relief or a bas relief, you know that term, sculpture. Most sculptures were freestanding, so they could be portable and small and carried around. We usually don't see large-scale sculpture. In fact, this is one of the largest, and it's a whopping 18 inches. So we're not talking about anything super huge here. But this is also permanently carved into, it was outside of a cave. So it it's very unique and rare. But we see a very similar image of a woman with her reproductive parts emphasized. You also notice that she's holding a horn. Horns are really important in Paleolithic art. In fact, look at all the horned animals that we see in the Lascaux scene here. Horns are representative of male power, right? Of also probably male fertility. So this is yet another fertility symbol, this image of this horn that she is holding. But if we kind of zoom out of history a bit, we start to realize that there is a trend. That you are looking at here on the right, a series of these sculptures that were found all over Europe. From France to Spain to Austria, some as far east as modern-day Russia, and even some places in North Africa. But still mostly the European or the Near European world. And these sculptures were made over a long period of time. Some of them are significantly older than the Venus, or I'm sorry, the Woman of Willendorf. Some of them date to 30, almost 40,000 years BC, and some of them are much newer and date up to 15,000 BC or BCE. What this tells us is that this image was consistent and prevalent, and that culture after culture after culture after culture utilize these images. Now, there's differences. The woman isn't always, sometimes her anatomy isn't always as enlarged as in others. Sometimes she has a face, sometimes she doesn't. She's in different positions. So there are changes because we're looking at tens of thousands of years of time. We're looking at cultures that changed, languages that changed, religious beliefs that changed over these various eras. So, but there is certainly a trend, isn't there? There is certainly a trend here. Now we're going to move from the Paleolithic to the Neolithic. Neolithic literally means new Stone Age. And the Neolithic sort of begins around the end of the Ice Age. So around 11 or 12,000 BC, we start to see climate change, and the weather gets warmer. The climate gets warmer, and this means, though, that there's significant changes. A lot of the animals that humans in Europe had been hunting die off, or they migrate away. And so those food sources are no longer there. So the human beings in Europe go away, and Europe goes dark. And all of that cave art that we see stops. All those sculptures that we saw stop. And so we shift our attention now more towards the east. We're going to be looking at first of all, Turkey, and then we're going to be looking at the Middle East, or what we call Mesopotamia. So first of all, though, let's talk about a place called Çatalhöyük. Çatalhöyük is one of the earliest cities. It is a city with no streets, but the houses are clustered together, and access to all the houses would have been through the rooftops. But this is a very, very early city here. We're talking around 6,000 BC or so when this is created. It's not the oldest, but it's certainly one of the oldest. And what's starting to change here? What's causing people to start to build cities and create what we will know as civilization? Well, there's a debate among historians. Some historians believe that what happened was we discovered agriculture. We discovered animal husbandry and how to breed and raise animals, and we learned about farming, and we learned how to grow crops. And after doing this, we realized we don't have to be hunter-gatherers. We can stay in one place, we can stay in one place and grow our food here. That means we can build bigger things. That means we can build more complex places to live, and towns and villages and ultimately cities to live in, and our life and society will become more complex. We'll need to invent things like writing and economies and organized governments and religions to control these populations now living in urban areas. But there's another debate. There's a debate that says, no, the opposite happened. And there are some historians who say that we actually just got tired of moving around and we started to build more permanent dwellings. And that forced us to create agriculture. We realized, well, we don't want to move around, so what can we do now? Oh, we got to grow our own crops. We got to breed our own animals. So I don't know. I'm not an expert in this subject. I'm not a paleo agriculturalist. I don't know. But I do know there's a debate. But what's important for us is people stop moving around. When they stop moving around, they start to build bigger stuff.